Beneath Florida's glassy springs, two divers chase glory. What they find will rewrite rules and cost lives. First comes the hush, pressure, darkness, narrowing stone. Silence thickens, silt hangs like a warning. Limestone corridors draw you in, and don't let go. One choice can seal a fate. A limestone maze shaped by groundwater over thousands of years. This is the Floridan Aquifer, a pressurized river beneath the state that feeds the springs. Each spring is an entrance, a route into blue chambers and flooded corridors, with tunnels that run for miles through the rock. For decades, few people saw them. Now, explorers map and film what was once unknown. It's beautiful, but it doesn't care if you're ready. Here, water, depth, and rock set the rules. Florida's springs hide a landscape few will ever see. Sunlight drops to a narrow cone, dust like silt floats in the beam. Calm water can hide real hazards. Go deeper, and your world shrinks to a light and a guideline. Passages twist, narrow, and fork. One wrong turn ends at solid rock. Breath and heartbeat are the only sounds, your link to the surface. It is breathtaking and unforgiving. Water is clear, but it contains no air. Rock is strong yet brittle. Ceilings can fall. Silt waits undisturbed for years, and one kick can erase visibility to zero. In that blackout, up feels like down, left like right, and the exit seems to vanish. This place does not forgive mistakes. It demands training, discipline, and a clear plan. In this video, we are going to uncover the story of the Florida Cave Bell tragedy and the impact it has had on the world of exploration. Make sure to subscribe to the channel to see more true exploration stories from the deep. Divers come for exploration, mapping, and the quiet pull of going where maps end. The cost can be high. Every foot inward is a wager against pressure and time, and the finite gas on your back. These caves can inspire or trap. Next, we step into the era that changed everything. In the early 1970s, cave diving in Florida entered a pivotal and perilous chapter in underwater exploration. Across the state, a new breed of adventurer turned from open water to the dark mouths of springs, and recreational cave diving was born, driven by a maverick spirit. Bold experimentation pushed boundaries, even as formal training and regulation barely existed. A small, insular community chased blank spaces on the map, cobbling together open water gear with homemade contraptions. In garages, they fabricated lights, customized regulators, and built experimental devices. Crude rope lines marked passages, and repurposed twin steel tanks were lashed together to stretch time underground. Ingenuity and courage were abundant. Understanding of the environment's lethality often was not. Just below the surface lay a vast frontier: Peacock Springs, Ginny Springs, the Devil's Eye, names that became beacons to the curious. Knowledge moved by word of mouth. Routes were sketched on diner napkins. Modern safety nets, redundant gear, continuous guidelines, disciplined gas management were still being learned, often the hard way. Hard-won lessons followed, too often carved by fatal mistakes. Breakthroughs shadowed by near misses, gear failures, sudden silt-outs, air dwindling far from daylight. Before long, Florida led the world in cave diving deaths. The gap between discovery and disaster narrowed to a blade. A golden age of finding and a dark toll of loss. The deep kept many of its bravest. In Florida's flooded caves, the most dangerous forces aren't creatures in the dark, but simple physics, quiet, indifferent, and always at work. A single misplaced kick lifts the floor itself. Dust-fine clay and sand rise like smoke, turning clear water into a wall of brown. In seconds, the world that felt open becomes a blind room where even your own hands vanish. When that silt-out blooms, the urge is to thrash and search for light, but every movement only feeds the storm. The guideline that led you inward, so obvious a moment ago, shrinks to a thread you can barely feel. Direction loses meaning, left and right swap places, The mind whispers that the exit must be just ahead, even as you drift deeper. The other danger is in the air you breathe. In any sealed pocket, an unventilated chamber, a trapped bubble, or an improvised bell, the mix begins to change. Each breath burns oxygen and leaves carbon dioxide behind, and without fresh flow to reset that balance, the atmosphere turns on you. Low oxygen, hypoxia, doesn't announce itself with a choke. It steals judgment first, fogging thought and dulling decisions. Meanwhile, rising CO2, hypercapnia, hammers the body with a pounding head, a tight chest, and an iron command to breathe faster. Panic feels reasonable. It's written into your blood chemistry. Together, those forces make escape unlikely. Vision narrows, movements grow clumsy. The plan you rehearsed fades under a roar of breath and heartbeat. In these places, survival belongs to the divers who slow down, who keep a hand on the line, who respect that air, light, and time are all running meters. This is the physics of entrapment, never theatrical, always patient. In overhead environments, mistakes aren't punished loudly. They're collected quietly, second by second, until there's nothing left to trade. By mid-1973, the Florida cave diving community was at a precarious crossroads. The past several years had been a whirlwind of rapid, unchecked expansion. The number of divers had grown. The equipment had become more powerful. The penetrations into the earth had become deeper and more audacious than ever before. A vast amount of territory had been charted, but the cost had been extraordinarily high. The rising fatality rate was becoming impossible to ignore, a dark shadow that loomed over the entire sport. State agencies were issuing increasingly dire warnings, and the nascent safety organizations were struggling to be heard over the roar of ambition. This period represented a critical tipping point. On one side was the old guard, the pioneers who thrived on risk and improvisation, who believed that courage and ingenuity were the only certifications needed. On the other side, a new consciousness was beginning to dawn, one born from tragedy. This emerging philosophy championed methodical planning, redundant systems, and rigorous training. A small group of hobbyist divers, captivated by these tales of discovery and steeped in the era's can-do spirit, began to formulate a plan. They had heard whispers of an unmapped cavern system, a promising lead near a known spring. They believed that with the right tool, they too could make their mark. Their plan was ambitious, centering on the construction and use of their own improvised diving bell. This device, they believed, would be their key to unlocking the cave, their underwater base camp for an extended expedition. It was the culmination of all the era's trends, homemade equipment, the desire for deeper and longer dives, and a profound underestimation of the invisible dangers. As the hot, humid Florida summer of 1973 began, the pieces were falling into place for a tragedy that would serve as a brutal and definitive lesson. A generation stood on the brink, and for some, the next step would be into darkness. And sadly, that step was about to be taken. The morning of June 24, 1973, dawned hot and still. At the edge of the spring, the atmosphere was tense with nervous excitement and focused activity. The two divers who would make the descent, John and Michael, performed their final gear checks. They were equipped with standard gear for the era. Heavy steel twin tanks connected to a single regulator. They were capable divers by open water standards, but they were about to step far beyond the bounds of their training and experience. They slipped into the dark, cool water. After a final signal to the surface crew, they began their descent, pulling themselves down the pre-laid guideline into the mouth of the cave. The sunlight from the surface faded quickly. Narrow, penetrating beams from their dive lights took over. The world contracted, reduced to the small circle of illumination and the reassuring rope in their hands. Silence enveloped them, broken only by the steady, rhythmic sound of their breathing. The initial part of the descent was straightforward, following the path set on previous weekends. They moved down the vertical entrance shaft and into the first large chamber. Their objective: find a stable, rocky outcrop to land the bell. They signaled to each other with their lights, confirming position and plan. 3 sharp tugs on the rope. On the surface, the crew responded, beginning the most critical and hazardous phase of the operation, lowering the bell. The immense weight of the steel structure, even with the buoyancy of the air trapped inside, made it incredibly difficult to manage. It did not descend gracefully. It tilted and swayed, its movements clumsy and unpredictable, bumping against the sides of the vertical entrance shaft. As the bell cleared the entrance shaft and entered the main chamber, its movement became even more erratic. It was like a pendulum, swinging slowly in the dark water, its trajectory dictated by slight currents and the uneven pull of the rope from above. They encountered a detail that wasn't on their mental map. The ceiling, which they thought high and vaulted, dipped down unexpectedly, creating a wide but low archway. The bell, however, was wider than the lowest point of the archway. With a final coordinated heave, the divers pushed the bell forward. It moved a few more inches and then stopped. It did not just stop, it settled. The bottom edge of the bell, dug into the silt bed, acted like a plow, churning up decades of accumulated sediment. The fine, powdery material erupted into the water column in a thick, boiling plume. The silt cloud expanded with terrifying speed. The powerful beams from the divers' lights, which moments before had cut through the murky water, were now useless. The light simply hit the wall of suspended particles and scattered, illuminating nothing but a blinding, featureless fog just inches from their faces. John and Michael were now completely alone, each suspended in his own private universe of blackness. One of the divers, likely by accident, bumped into the cold metal of the bell. He found the open bottom of the bell and, in a moment of desperation, made a fateful decision to seek refuge inside the very object that had caused the disaster. He pulled himself up and into the air pocket. His head broke the surface of the water inside the bell, and he was met with a different kind of darkness, the absolute black of an unlit, enclosed space. He could breathe. He ripped the regulator from his mouth, gasping the thick, humid air. The immediate relief would have been immense. He may have fumbled for a backup light, perhaps a small chemical stick, cracking it to life. The small space would have been filled with a weak, ghostly glow, revealing the raw, unfinished interior of their homemade creation. Michael had not made it inside. The initial sense of relief would have quickly given way to a new and more complex form of dread. He was trapped. The bell was immovably stuck. He was in a tiny, artificial bubble of air, hundreds of feet inside a flooded cave, with no clear path of escape. His best, perhaps only chance of survival, seemed to be to wait. The air trapped inside the diving bell was a finite resource. As John floated inside the bell, his body was acting as a slow-burning engine, consuming oxygen with every inhalation. The initial effects, hypoxia, are not alarming. There is no choking sensation, no desperate gasp for air. Instead, the symptoms are insidious and neurological. With every breath John exhaled, he was releasing carbon dioxide into the small, sealed atmosphere of the bell. As CO2 in the bell climbed, John's body would have sounded increasingly frantic alarms. The first symptom, breathing rate, increased. Breathlessness set in, unable to get a full, satisfying breath. The cruel paradox: feels like suffocating while surrounded by air. In the final minutes, the combination of severe hypoxia and hypercapnia would have driven John into a state of irrational, animalistic panic. Any semblance of planning or logical thought would have been completely obliterated. He may have attempted a final desperate escape. Overwhelmed by suffocation, he might have tried to submerge himself again to get back into the water, but his body, starved of oxygen, would have been weak. His mind, poisoned by CO2, would have been incapable of remembering basic scuba steps. This burst of activity was short-lived. The exertion would have consumed the last usable oxygen in his blood. His muscles ceased to respond. His vision closed in. The storm in his mind quieted. He lost consciousness and slumped forward into the dark water of the bell. For his partner Michael, the end came differently but was just as certain. Lost in a zero-visibility cloud, he succumbed to the same problem: a finite air supply. The rhythmic hiss of his regulator grew thin, then stopped. In the cold, silent black water, he too surrendered to the darkness, just yards from the flawed sanctuary his friend had reached. Back on the surface, time stretched into an elastic, agonizing band. The initial confidence of the support crew had long since evaporated, replaced by a growing, gnawing anxiety. They took turns pulling on it and shouting into the still afternoon, but there was only unnerving silence. No answering tugs, no streams of bubbles disturbing the dark spring. With the sun descending, they finally made the call. They drove to town and found a phone, voices strained as they explained the situation to the sheriff. Emergency response began to move, slow and methodical. But as evening fell, those who knew cave diving understood the truth. This was now a recovery. The first pair of recovery divers slipped into the cold, dark water. They were equipped with powerful lights, followed a thin, strong, modern-style guideline, a stark contrast to the tangled clothesline left by the previous team. As they descended into the entrance shaft, the extent of the initial problem became immediately apparent. The water was not just murky, it was a thick brown soup. Visibility was virtually non-existent. Entering the main chamber, utter chaos. A thick rope hung in a tangled loop from the ceiling, snagged on rock formations. The original guideline was buried under fresh silt or tangled in the rigging, unusable as a path to safety. After tense minutes of searching, a flash of reflected light cut through the murk. One diver spotted it, partially buried in a silt dune, scuba tank, diver's harness. It was Michael, motionless on the cave floor. The recovery divers marked Michael's location with a directional arrow on their guideline, but made no attempt to move him. Their focus shifted to the second diver, John. They approached where the bell was last seen. The water grew thicker, choked with sediment. A huge section of the silt bed cascaded down, forming an unstable wall of mud that blocked the passage. A second team of divers, specialists in navigating extreme silt and tight restrictions, would make another attempt. Their approach would be different. They would try to go over the top of the silt slide, in the small remaining gap between the top of the mud wall and the cave ceiling. Taking a deep breath and steadying his nerves, he began to pull himself through the restriction. Silt rained down from the ceiling and billowed up from below, instantly enveloping him in a thick black cloud. He was now moving completely blind. After what felt like an eternity, his outstretched hand touched something hard and cold. It was metal. He had reached the bell. His light cut through the gloom, and the scene before him was one of eerie stillness. The bell was tilted at a sharp angle, its open bottom partially buried in the silt slide. Peering inside with his powerful light, he saw him. John was floating motionless in the small air pocket. The recovery diver's training immediately took over. He documented the scene with a waterproof camera, capturing the grim tableau for the investigation that would follow. He quickly determined the answer to both was a definitive no. The situation was far too unstable and dangerous. The bell was under immense pressure from the surrounding rock. Any attempt to cut it open or shift it could make the fragile limestone fracture. That could send tons of rock crashing down on the recovery team. With a heavy heart, he secured the bell entrance and tied a line across the opening. A symbolic closing, a final act. He began the slow, careful retreat, leaving John entombed in the silent, dark chamber. Back on the surface, the second team's report confirmed the worst fears of the recovery coordinators. The lead recovery diver, a man who had participated in more of these operations than he cared to remember, made the official recommendation. The recovery of the second victim, John, should be abandoned. Officials reluctantly concurred. The sheriff announced the active recovery operation was to be halted. The entrance to the spring would be sealed off. The cave would become a designated grave, a permanent memorial to the two men who had perished within its depths. With the recovery operation concluded, the focus shifted to investigation. The newly formed National Association for Cave Diving and the National Speleological Society's cave diving section. This incident was not an isolated anomaly, a textbook example of what was wrong. Investigators interviewed the surface crew and the recovery divers at length, meticulously reconstructing the timeline of the disaster. They documented the design of the homemade bell, noting its lack of ventilation, its clumsy deployment system, and its complete unsuitability for a cave environment. The primary cause was attributed to gross diver error, from a complete lack of formal cave training. The divers had violated every fundamental rule of safe cave exploration. They had entered an unknown system with poor visibility. They had no concept of proper gas management. They used untested and dangerous experimental equipment, and they had no viable emergency plan. This incident, and others from the same period, became cornerstones of the new safety curriculum by NACD and NSS-CDS. The story of the diving bell disaster was used in training lectures as a powerful cautionary tale. The 1973 diving bell tragedy was a brutal but effective catalyst for change. It was one of several high-profile fatalities in the early 1970s that forced the cave diving community to confront its reckless culture. The concept of using improvised air bells or relying on natural air pockets was completely abandoned. The rule of thirds for gas management became an ironclad law. The importance of redundant equipment, including backup lights and a fully independent backup breathing system, became a core tenet of the sport. Training and certification became mandatory. Accident analysis became a systematic practice, with every incident, fatal or not, being deconstructed to learn from its mistakes. The maverick was replaced by the technician. The story of the 1973 tragedy serves as a somber reminder of the thin line between bold exploration and fatal hubris. Their legacy, and the legacy of all those who died in that dark, formative era, is the safety and relative predictability of the sport today. Every diver who now returns safely from the depths does so by following rules written by the ghosts of the past. The divers of the 1973 incident were heirs to that legacy, drawn to the deep by the irresistible pull of the unknown. Their story is a somber meditation on the inherent relationship between exploration and risk. John and Michael were not driven by a death wish, but by a dream. They envisioned a successful expedition, a triumph of their own making. They saw their bell not as a trap, but as a key. In the silent, crystal-clear passages of Florida's caves today, every safe dive is a quiet tribute to those who, long ago, ventured into the darkness and never returned. Subscribe for more deep dive documentary stories.